When they found Charlotte Devo floating lifeless in her marble bathhouse, the water was still warm, her silk nightgown clinging to her body like moss on a cypress tree. But by then, Sarah Daniels had already slipped away into the Louisiana Bayou, carrying a secret that would shadow Magnolia Grove for generations. What could drive an enslaved woman to hold her mistress beneath the water until the bubbles stopped? And how did she endure the swamps, where even seasoned hunters feared to go? Before I continue, take a second to subscribe and let me know in the comments where you're watching from. That morning, the sun stretched across Magnolia Grove, laying long shadows as Sarah moved barefoot through the wet grass toward the grand bathhouse. The structure stood apart from the main plantation home, its white columns gleaming in the early light, proud and eerie, like the bones of something ancient. Inside, the walls of marble caught the echoes of water steam curling into the air from the heated pool that Charlotte demanded be filled anew each dawn. Sarah carried a basket of lavender soap and coarse cotton towels, her hands steady from years of repetition. She had been bought into the Devo household at 12, a child with small hands that her mistress deemed perfect for tending delicate tasks. Now at 19, she knew every detail of Charlotte's morning ritual. Charlotte Devo, 32, with her carefully arranged auburn curls and green eyes that could dance or cut like glass, reclined in the pool when Sarah entered. The silence between them was sharp, layered with the weight of something neither dared to name. "You're late," Charlotte drawled, her southern sweetness edged with steel. Sarah, eyes cast down, murmured an apology, explaining that Master Devo's boots had delayed her. It was true, though she had also stolen a moment to check on her younger sister Lily, who lay fevered in the slave quarters. At 15, Lily was already drawing the attention of Robert the Master's son, a fact that filled Sarah with a sick dread. Charlotte's laugh was brittle, her words dismissive as glass splintering. The bathhouse itself had been a gift, a symbol of wealth and arrogance designed to rival the Roman baths Charlotte had read about while abroad. Each morning, Sarah heated water to the precise warmth Charlotte preferred, steeped it with imported oils until the air was heavy with jasmine, then scrubbed her mistress's skin raw with honey and salt until it glowed. But on this morning, as Sarah knelt to dip a cloth in the fragrant water, Charlotte's hand shot out, clamping around her wrist with startling force. Sarah flinched at the touch, not from fear of harm, but from the memory of what those same hands had done only days before. Charlotte's gaze, those green eyes sharp as knives, locked on hers. "I've been thinking about our conversation," she whispered, grip tightening until Sarah's pulse hammered beneath her fingers. "About what you told me concerning your sister." That conversation, Sarah's desperate plea to protect Lily from Robert, still lingered in the marble chamber like smoke. Sarah had revealed more than she ever intended, spilling family secrets in hopes of mercy. And now, in that warm, perfumed air, she realized mercy might not be what Charlotte had in mind. Charlotte's response was nothing Sarah could have prepared for, nothing she could even name without her hands shaking. Instead of the mercy she begged for, Charlotte had turned the plea into a bargain, one that shattered every boundary Sarah had left. "Miss Charlotte, please," she whispered, trying to slip her wrist free without provoking her. But Charlotte's nails pressed into her skin, leaving half-moons of pain that would bloom into angry red marks. The air in the bathhouse grew heavy, steam curling thick like smoke, as though the walls themselves wanted to hold Sarah captive. The water lapped against marble in slow, steady beats, a sound like a drum, counting down the moment when everything would change. With sudden ease, Charlotte released her, smiling as if nothing had happened. "Begin with my shoulders," she said, leaning back into the steaming water. Sarah's hands shook as she gathered the sea salt scrub, the rough grains scraping against her palms as she mixed them with fragrant oils. She had done this ritual countless times, yet today it felt different, her touch no longer simple duty, but weighted with unspoken demands. As she worked the scrub over Charlotte's pale skin, the woman's voice slipped low just above the ripples in the pool. "I received a letter from my cousin in Charleston." Charlotte murmured, her tone almost dreamy. "She writes of a new law, one that considers certain loyal slaves worthy of privileges." Sarah's hand faltered, then resumed its motion, each stroke deliberate. She knew Charlotte well enough to recognize this as prelude, the careful laying of traps in words. Charlotte's hair floated like copper seaweed in the water, her eyes closing as if savoring the game. "These loyal ones," she continued, "are sometimes granted freedoms others can never hope for. Freedom to protect those they love, perhaps." The implication twisted Sarah's stomach. Charlotte was dangling Lily's safety like a prize on a hook. But the cost was clear: her body, her dignity, the last untouched piece of herself. Her hands moved as if separate from her mind, scrubbing Charlotte's arms, working away layers of skin, while her thoughts ran wild, weighing what she could bear against what she could not. "You understand what I am offering," Charlotte said, eyes opening to lock on Sarah. There was hunger there, sharp and desperate, and it made Sarah want to flee. But outside these walls was nothing but swamp and ruin, a wilderness that swallowed runaways whole. Inside, Charlotte held the power of life and death with a word. Sarah's voice, when it came, was steady, though each syllable scorched her throat. "I understand, Miss Charlotte." The words were ash, but they were all she had to shield her sister. Charlotte's smile was slow, triumphant, and she traced a finger across Sarah's cheek with cruel tenderness. "I knew you were clever, much cleverer than the others. That is why you are perfect." The days that followed blurred into a nightmare of summons and secrets. Charlotte found reasons to call Sarah at all hours, sometimes under the guise of bathing more often, for things that left Sarah hollow, her spirit carved thinner each time. The other slaves noticed their eyes heavy with unspoken judgment, pity sharper than any whip. Yet Lily remained untouched, spared from Robert's gaze, and that single fact kept Sarah alive. 3 weeks passed before the truth revealed itself. While dusting Charlotte's private chambers, Sarah found a letter lying open on the desk, carelessly abandoned. One glance at its contents sent ice through her veins, because in that moment Sarah realized everything she had sacrificed, everything she had endured, had been built on a lie. The letter was a fraud. Written in Charlotte's cousin's neat hand, it contained no mention of laws, no whispers of privileges for the loyal. Instead, it rambled with trivial gossip about acquaintances and petty complaints about the Charleston heat. All of it ordinary, all of it proof that Charlotte's tale had been nothing but invention, a cruel fabrication designed to bend Sarah's will. The truth knocked the breath from her chest, leaving her bent over the polished desk where the perfumed lie rested in elegant script. Every humiliation, every hollow surrender, every violation of her body and spirit paid to a debt that never existed. Lily was no safer than before, and Sarah had been reduced to nothing for the sake of Charlotte's amusement. Rage welled up raw and searing, hotter than fear, hotter than despair. It filled her veins until it felt like her skin would split open. That night, lying on her straw mattress, she stared at the rough-hewn ceiling, while the breaths of sleeping women rose and fell around her, in rhythm. The sound, once a comfort, now marked time like a ticking clock. She thought of Charlotte's daily bath ritual, of the marble house built for her solitude, the warm pool where she reclined as if she were a queen. Sarah thought of water, how it could soothe, cleanse, and heal, but also how easily it could drown, silence, erase. She thought of Lily, still a child, already hunted by Robert's eyes. If not stopped, he would consume her, and Sarah would not let that happen. Dawn broke gray and heavy storm clouds bruising the horizon. Sarah carried her basket as always, lavender soaps, towels folded neatly. But beneath the fabric rested a small glass bottle of laudanum stolen from the medicine cabinet. Just enough to dull her mistress's strength to leave her pliant when the moment came. She prepared the bath with careful precision, pouring oils into steaming water until the air bloomed thick with jasmine. Her heart hammered against her ribs, but her hands moved steady as if they already knew their purpose. Charlotte entered at 7 sharp, draped in a robe of pale silk, her mood bright, her lips humming a tune from childhood piano lessons. "Good morning, my dear," she purred a phrase that had curdled into mockery. Sarah lowered her eyes, murmured the expected reply, and guided her mistress to the bath. Charlotte sighed as the warm water embraced her, her eyes closing in lazy contentment. The ritual began. Soap into a lather, strokes over skin, the same movements repeated countless mornings. But today, each motion was layered with intent. Sarah's fingers moved over Charlotte's pale shoulders, memorizing their weight, the texture of flesh untouched by labor or sun. She committed it all to memory, the smoothness, the fragility, because it would soon be gone. "I have the most delightful news," Charlotte said. Her eyes still closed, her voice languid with self-satisfaction. "My husband has agreed to purchase that Henderson girl, the one with the lovely figure." "Robert will be very pleased." Sarah froze just for a heartbeat. The words burned through her like acid. Another girl no older than Lily, about to be fed into the same machine of cruelty. To Charlotte, it was nothing more than acquiring another trinket, another ornament for Robert's appetites. Sarah's vision blurred, but her hands did not falter. She smoothed soap across Charlotte's collarbone, her voice soft and obedient. "That is wonderful news, Miss Charlotte." Inside, though, her mind was a storm. If Charlotte saw her smile, then she might have mistaken it for submission. But Sarah was already imagining the silence of water closing over pale skin, already tasting the moment when false intimacy would end and justice, cold, final, and merciless, would take its place. The world that had led them to this moment was centuries old, built brick by brick on broken backs, on stolen futures, on the belief that some lives existed only to sweeten the comfort of others. As Sarah's hand slid over Charlotte's arms and across her chest, the mistress prattled on as though she were planning a social luncheon rather than discussing flesh and blood. "Of course you'll have more company in your special duties," she said with a smirk, her voice dripping with false intimacy. "I've been thinking about expanding my collection. There's something so delightful about having beautiful things always at one's disposal." The casual cruelty in those words was the spark that hardened Sarah's resolve into iron. She reached for the hidden bottle beneath the towels. Her movements were unhurried, deliberate, the product of years of practice, concealing true intent. "Miss Charlotte," she said, her voice calm, even gentle, "I brought you something new today. An oil from New Orleans. They say it helps with relaxation." Charlotte's eyes lit up at once. Luxury was her only true devotion. "How thoughtful," she said, settling deeper into the water. Sarah uncorked the laudanum, poured it in, and watched it dissolve, invisible as vengeance. The drug would not kill, but it would soften, slow sap Charlotte's strength. Within minutes, her mistress's lids grew heavy, her voice slurred. "This is lovely. Where did you say you found it?" Sarah's reply was low, steady. "From someone who understands suffering." Something in her tone made Charlotte's eyes snap open. The fog of the drug pierced by sudden fear. For the first time, she seemed to see Sarah not as a servant, not as property, but as a woman in her own right, a woman with a will sharpened to a blade's edge. The recognition came too late. Charlotte began to push herself upright, instinct stirring despite the weight in her limbs. But Sarah's hands were faster, pressing down on her mistress's shoulders with the strength of fury long suppressed. "You lied to me," she whispered, and the words carried generations of grief and rage. There was never any protection for Lily. You made it all up to get what you wanted. Charlotte's green eyes widened, shock and terror spilling across features that had always been so carefully composed. She opened her mouth, whether to plead or to bargain. Sarah never knew. The attempt ended in bubbles, the water itself betraying her, as Sarah forced her beneath the surface. The bathhouse, once Charlotte's sanctuary of marble and steam, became her coffin. The perfumed oils she adored slicked her hair to her skull, and the jasmine scent mixed with the acrid tang of fear. The fight dragged on longer than Sarah had imagined. Charlotte's instincts were primal, her survival ferocity born of privilege that had never known real danger. Her nails raked Sarah's arms, carving bloody tracks that would scar forever a red brand of the moment when the powerless seized power. But the laudanum dulled her speed, and Sarah's wiry strength, honed by years of carrying, scrubbing, bending, enduring, proved inexorable. She pressed down steady and unyielding until the thrashing slowed, until the bubbles ceased, until silence returned to the marble chamber. Charlotte Devo, mistress of Magnolia Grove, drowned in the very waters she had demanded be poured fresh each morning. And Sarah Daniels, her hands torn and bleeding, stood over her, not as a servant, not as a victim, but as executioner. As Charlotte's last bubbles rose and vanished into the perfumed water, Sarah felt a part of herself collapse and hollow out. She had crossed a boundary that could never be undone, and though her hands still trembled with the memory of holding her mistress under, she felt no regret, only the quiet weight of justice finally settling over Magnolia Grove. Charlotte Devo, who had treated living souls as trinkets and playthings, had been taught in her final moments that cruelty breeds consequence. Sarah worked with the same precision she had shown in every service over the past 7 years. She arranged Charlotte's body so it looked like she had merely slipped beneath the water, her limbs languid, her features softened by the laudanum's haze. She scrubbed away the evidence of struggle from the marble walls and floor, her hands steady and efficient. Every inch of the bathhouse was familiar, and that familiarity became her shield. When she finally knelt beside the pool, she touched Charlotte's cool forehead. To anyone watching, it might have looked like a gesture of grief. In truth, Sarah whispered a vow to the old spirits her grandmother had spoken of, the ones that dwelled in water and wind. Charlotte's death, she swore, would protect others, even if no church bell ever rang for her soul. The plantation stirred with its usual rhythm when Sarah returned to the quarters. She braided Lily's hair with practiced fingers, spooned cornmeal mush from the pot, and smiled at the familiar voices rising in the dawn. Yet beneath the mask of normalcy, she was storing memories, faces, laughter, the warmth of her sister's hand. These things she carried with her, more precious than anything she could pack. It was another slave who discovered Charlotte's body near noon, and the screams brought the plantation to a halt. Master Devo himself stood stricken at the marble pool, pale and shaken. For the first time, Sarah saw doubt crack the mask of control he always wore. The questioning began immediately. Every slave who had entered the bathhouse was pulled aside, their words picked apart. Sarah told her story calmly, how she had stepped out to fetch fresh towels, how she returned to find her mistress already submerged. Her account had just enough truth to seem natural, just enough vagueness to explain her failure to save Charlotte. It would hold, but only for a time. She knew suspicion would come. Whispers already stirred about her special duties, and soon those whispers would become accusations. That night, while the plantation reeled from tragedy, Sarah prepared. She gathered what little she had. Her grandmother's worn hair ribbons, a cross her father had forged from iron before death took him, small tokens of strength and memory. She bound them in cloth tight enough to survive the swamp waters. Before dawn, Lily found her. The girl's eyes glistened in the darkness, her voice breaking as she said, "You're leaving?" It was not a question. Sarah pulled her close, memorizing the warmth and weight of her sister in her arms. "I have to," she whispered. "But this isn't forever. When it's safe, I'll come back." It was a promise Sarah might never keep, but it was the only gift she could leave behind. Lily's small body trembled, but her words were steady. "I'll be strong." And Sarah knew she would be. When Magnolia Grove finally sank into restless sleep, Sarah slipped away like a shadow. She moved past overseers and dogs, past the silent big house, and into the dark tangle of the Louisiana Bayou. Behind her, the plantation slumbered in ignorance, and ahead stretched a labyrinth of cypress and water, veiled in Spanish moss. The swamp promised freedom, but it also promised danger. Snakes, gators, fever, and the ghosts of those who had never made it through. Yet Sarah stepped forward, carrying her ancestors' strength and the memory of Lily's promise into a darkness that was terrifying and holy all at once. The bayou swallowed Sarah whole in a way Magnolia Grove never could. Every step forward was like crossing into a realm where the plantation's laws had no meaning yet. The air was thick with older rules, unspoken laws carved by water roots and shadow. The warm muck rose around her ankles, carrying the scent of rot and renewal. And all around her, the swamp stirred with unseen life. Logs shifted with the silent glide of alligators, their eyes catching fire in the moonlight. Snakes draped themselves like ribbons over low branches, waiting with patient hunger. Beneath the dark surface, catfish as large as children stirred the mud. But for all its natural terrors, the swamp also held something else, whispers of freedom. Stories had passed through slave quarters for generations about marooned communities, hidden enclaves of escaped men and women who had beaten the odds, who had bent the bayou to their survival. Sarah had always half believed them part myth and part hope. But now, with each step deeper into the swamp, with the plantation fading behind her, and the night sounds swelling around her, the stories began to feel real. The first day nearly broke her. Heat pressed down like a physical weight trapped under the canopy and reflected off the water until the air shimmered. Mosquitoes rose in swarms so thick they blurred her vision and left her skin blistered with bites. The little water she had brought from the plantation was gone by sundown, and the swamp's brackish water nearly made her retch. Still, she pressed on. Capture meant death or worse, and that truth gave her strength. She taught herself quickly, testing each step with a stick, watching for the subtle shift that meant an alligator lay beneath, moving quiet enough not to stir the swamp's ruling creatures. Her grandmother's old stories returned to her, tales of river spirits and trees with memory, and she began to feel the bayou as more than a place. It was alive, and she was walking through the veins of something ancient. On her third day, when her body shook from hunger and her tongue was thick from thirst, she heard it. A sound rising low and steady, threading through the air like mist singing. At first she thought it was her mind breaking fever, weaving hallucinations. But the voices grew stronger, rich with harmony, blending with the swamp's rhythm as if they had been born here. She pushed through a wall of mangrove's branches clawing at her arms and stumbled into a clearing, where the swamp widened into a black glass lake. Across the water she saw them. Homes built into the trees' walkways, woven from cypress and rope smoke curling from fires, hidden cleverly beneath the canopy. Figures moved easily, confidently, as if they had grown from the roots themselves. It was real. A maroon settlement carved from stubbornness and hope in the heart of the swamp. The singing stopped the moment they saw her. Shadows coalesced into people stepping out of the trees, and water with spears, machetes, and sharpened tools turned to weapons. Sarah froze, chest heaving, surrounded by men and women who looked like the swamp had birthed them. Their faces weren't cruel but watchful, weighing whether she was threat or prey. From among them stepped a woman wrapped in a headscarf of deep colors, her eyes sharp as glass, her presence commanding. She studied Sarah for what felt like hours, before speaking, her voice calm, but edged with authority. "You running from something? Or running to something?" The truth welled up before Sarah could stop it. Both she whispered, her voice rough but steady. The answer seemed to please the woman, who gave a slow nod. Weapons lowered. Relief surged through Sarah so strong her knees nearly buckled. "I'm Mama Brigitte," the woman said, and the respect in the title was clear. She was more than a leader. She was the spirit and spine of this hidden world. And Sarah understood in that moment she had not reached the end of her journey, but its beginning. "And you look like someone with a story worth hearing." Mama Brigitte's words marked the beginning of a new chapter in Sarah's life. One she could never have imagined while kneeling beside Charlotte Devo's marble bath. The community that welcomed her was a miracle stitched from mud, timber, and memory. Nearly 200 men, women, and children who had built their freedom in the very swamp meant to contain them. They lived by a rhythm that was both ancient and practical. Rice grew in fields that blended seamlessly into marshland. Chickens clucked from platforms high above the waterline. Pigs rooted in pens lashed to cypress trunks. Fish traps and nets yielded a steady harvest, while hunters slipped through the reeds to bring back game. Most importantly, no overseer's whip cracked here. No master's voice demanded obedience. For the first time in Sarah's life, black men and women governed themselves, choosing their own paths under the canopy of moss and sky. Sarah became part of them, slowly proving herself with each passing day. She treated fevers and wounds with remedies her grandmother had taught her. Bark boiled to fight infection, leaves ground into poultices to cool a burn. Her literacy, rare in the quarters, made her invaluable. She recorded names, births, and deaths, kept letters that traveled by secret hands to other maroon settlements hidden across the swamps. And her knowledge of plantation routines gave the community eyes into the enemy's world. She was a healer, a scribe, a witness. But beneath her contributions lay a wound she could not show. Charlotte's face haunted her dreams, surfacing from black water with eyes wide and accusing. The others had fled the crime of bondage, but Sarah carried blood on her hands. That distinction made her both dangerous and hunted. Posters with her likeness appeared in New Orleans, Baton Rouge, and beyond, promising gold for her capture. She became a name whispered in taverns and slave markets, an outlaw worth risking life and limb to track. Within weeks, search parties came crashing through the swamp with dogs straining at leashes, their shouts echoing like thunder. But the Maroons were prepared. They had lived for decades on the knife's edge of discovery, with sentries posted along the waterways and signals woven into bird calls and drumming patterns. When alarm came, the village dissolved like mist. Houses emptied, fires quenched, people melted into hollows, reed thickets, and secret trails. Sarah learned quickly, once hiding in the belly of a cypress tree while men with torches splashed so close she could hear their breath. She listened as they spoke of her by name, describing her skin, her hair, her voice, and most chilling of all, the reward for her return alive. Their words confirmed what she already suspected. Charlotte's death was no mystery. The white world had decided who was guilty, and it would never stop hunting her. Yet as the danger mounted, something else took root. Stories of Sarah began to spread like wildfire. Tales carried in whispers between plantations and slave quarters. The girl who had drowned her mistress and vanished into the bayou became more than flesh and blood. To some, she was a spirit of vengeance, a ghost who rose from swamp water to punish the cruel. To others, she was proof that even the powerless could rise up, strike back, and live free. The truth of her act blurred beneath the weight of legend, but the meaning grew larger than Sarah herself. She struggled with it at first. She had never meant to become a symbol. Her act was born of desperation, fury, love for her sister. But as more faces turned to her expecting guidance, Sarah began to accept the mantle that history pressed on her shoulders. She transformed from fugitive to leader, becoming a strategist in the Maroons' fight against the plantation world. By her second year in the swamp, raids had begun in earnest. Guided by Sarah's knowledge, they struck plantations like ghosts, their boats sliding from the morning mist to overwhelm guards and spirit slaves to safety. She learned to move like water, silent and unstoppable, heart-pounding with terror and triumph as chains fell from wrists that looked like her own. It was during one such raid near Baton Rouge, just as freedom was unfolding in her hands, that Sarah heard news that would shatter everything she thought she had escaped. Among the captives freed in the Baton Rouge raid was a young woman whose face Sarah recognized at once, someone from Magnolia Grove. Someone who carried the plantation's shadows with her. The woman's news came like a knife. Lily was gone. Sold after Sarah's escape, she had fallen into Robert Devoe's hands one last time. Drunk and enraged by her refusal, he had beaten her to death. Lily had died resisting, but also believing her sister had left her behind. The words shattered Sarah. All the sacrifices, all the blood and secrecy, the desperate bargain with Charlotte, every choice she had made for Lily's safety meant nothing. The protection had never existed. Her sister's life had been crushed under the same heel Sarah thought she'd outmaneuvered. The grief was so sharp it left her hollow, worse than the moment she drowned Charlotte, worse than any wound she had carried before. For weeks, she vanished into the swamp, living among shadows, speaking to the spirits her grandmother once invoked, pleading for meaning, for absolution that never came. It was Mama Bridget who found her there, perched on a mossy log stretched across black water. She sat beside Sarah without judgment, her voice steady as always. "Your sister's blood isn't yours to carry," she said. "It belongs to the man who took her life and to the system that gave him the right to try. You acted with what you knew, and that's all any of us can ever do." Her words cut through Sarah's despair, not with comfort, but with clarity. Sarah realized she stood at a crossroads. She could allow grief to rot her from within, or she could turn that grief into fire, into a force that might save others from Lily's fate. When she finally chose, it was like stepping out of a grave. She returned to the community harder, sharper, with her pain forged into purpose. From then on, she poured herself into the fight. She mapped out raids with a strategist's eye, her plans growing bolder and more precise. She studied plantations like puzzles, identifying weaknesses others had missed. Soon under her influence, the Maroons struck not just isolated farms, but fortified estates once thought untouchable. The stories that spread about Sarah grew darker and more powerful. To slave owners, she became a phantom who appeared from the swamp to burn their wealth and vanish with their human property. To the enslaved, she was living proof that vengeance could be claimed, that even the powerless could fight back. Mothers whispered her name to children as a prayer, and masters cursed it in their sleep. The system threatened began to adapt. Guards multiplied, patrols grew heavier, and bounties for her capture climbed to staggering heights. Even some slaves, ground down by fear or tempted by promises of mercy, turned informants, feeding scraps of intelligence back to their masters. The noose tightened around Sarah and her people. Yet still she fought, even as the swamp itself seemed to warn her that the struggle was nearing a breaking point. Mama Bridget listened to Sarah's plan with the stillness of someone weighing the scales of life and death. Around them, the council sat in tense silence, faces lit by flickering firelight, eyes reflecting both fear and hope. Sarah's voice carried steady, even as her heart thundered. If they waited, the army would descend in overwhelming numbers and erase their home as if it had never been. If they scattered, the swamp might swallow them one by one, cold and hunger doing what bullets could not. But if they struck first, if they turned fear into fire, the world would be forced to remember them, whether they survived or not. The debate stretched deep into the night. Some, weary of constant danger, begged for dispersal. Others, fueled by anger, wanted blood for every life taken in past raids and ambushes. It was Joseph, the old founder, who finally rose again, leaning heavily on his carved walking stick. "Every one of us here has already chosen death," once he said, voice gravelly but unshakable. "When we ran, when we refused the whip, when we dared to call ourselves free. This ain't about whether we die, it's about how we die and what kind of mark we leave for them who come after." His words settled over the gathering like a blessing and a curse. In the days that followed, preparations began in grim earnest. Weapons were sharpened, boats caulked, supplies divided. Scouts slipped silently through the bayou, gathering intelligence on the plantations and garrisons targeted for destruction. Sarah oversaw it all, with a focus that bordered on obsession, channeling her grief and rage into every detail. Her scars from Charlotte's nails still burned, reminders etched into her flesh, and her memories of Lily fueled her sleepless determination. This would not be survival. This would be war. When dawn finally broke, on the day of the offensive, mist clung thick to the swamp, muffling sound and sight. The community moved like a single organism, boats gliding from hidden channels, faces painted with mud and ash. They split into groups, each with its destination: sugar plantations, rice fields, slave markets. Sarah led one of the largest bands, her small frame cloaked in, resolve her eyes fixed on the horizon. The raids erupted with a ferocity the region had never seen. Plantations burned, their masters fleeing in terror. Slaves were unshackled and hustled onto boats that melted back into the swamp before soldiers could respond. Guard towers were toppled, stores of weapons seized, bridges sabotaged. For 2 days, chaos reigned across the bayou's edges, the maroons striking like ghosts and vanishing just as swiftly. But the retaliation came swift and merciless. By the 3rd day, organized columns of soldiers pressed deep into the swamp, their boats cutting through channels once thought impassable. Muskets cracked, fires raged, and for the first time in decades, the maroon settlements were no longer invisible. Families scattered under cannon fire, children carried on their parents' backs as flames consumed platforms that had stood for generations. In the midst of it all, Sarah refused to flee. Standing on a platform half consumed by fire, she rallied fighters again and again, her voice cutting through smoke and screams. To the soldiers, she was a phantom they could not kill. To the maroons, she was the anchor holding their courage together. Witnesses later claimed they saw her fighting waist-deep in the water, dragging wounded comrades to safety, firing a stolen musket until it was ripped from her hands. No one could agree on what happened to her in the end. Some swore she was struck down by a musket ball, her body sinking into the swamp to rest with the spirits she had always invoked. Others insisted they saw her vanish into the mist, wounded but alive, carried away by the bayou itself. What was certain was that her name lived on. In slave quarters from Louisiana to the Carolinas, whispers of Sarah Daniels became a gospel of defiance. To the oppressed, she was no longer flesh and blood, but a legend, the swamp woman, the mistress slayer, the ghost of Magnolia Grove. To masters, she was the nightmare that made them glance over their shoulders in the dark. Her life ended in shadow. but her story endured in fire. The soldiers who waited for her on that island expected to see a fugitive broken and desperate. What they found instead was a woman who carried herself like a queen. Sarah stepped from her canoe into the mud, with her head held high, the morning mist curling around her like a crown. The hush of the swamp seemed to bend toward her, as if even the cypress and water spirits recognized the gravity of the moment. She was unarmed, but she radiated the kind of authority no weapon could grant, a presence forged in fire, blood, and sacrifice. The commander read her terms aloud for all to hear. Amnesty for the non-combatants of the Maroon community. No reprisals against women, children, or elders. In return, Sarah would be taken to New Orleans, tried and executed publicly as a warning. She met his gaze without flinching, her voice steady as she confirmed the agreement. I am Sarah Daniels. I am the one you came for. The rest are innocent. Their freedom is my price. The soldiers bound her wrists, but she did not resist. Witnesses later said the men looked uneasy, as though they feared tying down a spirit rather than a woman. Some even swore the ropes twitched like living things in their hands. From the nearby trees, hidden eyes of Maroons and allies watched in silence, many weeping as they saw their leader give herself up so that they might live. Sarah offered no farewell. She had already said her goodbyes in the quiet of the night, whispering to the swamp itself, asking it to shelter her people long after she was gone. Her trial in New Orleans was little more than theater. Planters packed the courthouse, eager to see the infamous Mistress Slayer brought low. Pamphlets circulated describing her as a demon, a witch, a seductress, who had bewitched slaves into rebellion. Yet even in chains, Sarah refused to bow. When given the chance to speak before sentencing, she did not beg for mercy. Instead, she raised her chin and said, "If I am guilty, it is of loving my sister enough to fight for her, of loving my people enough to show them freedom is worth blood. If you fear me, it is because you know one day there will be more like me, and you cannot drown us all." The sentence was death by hanging. They scheduled it for dawn in Jackson Square, hoping the spectacle would frighten the enslaved into obedience. Instead, it gave birth to a legend. Hundreds gathered to watch, and when the rope tightened around her neck, many swore she did not look afraid, but defiant, her eyes fixed on the horizon, as if already seeing something beyond their reach. That morning, New Orleans was not silent. Whispers passed through the crowd. Slaves, free blacks, even some poor whites, carrying her last words like sparks in dry tinder. By nightfall, those sparks had become fire. Across Louisiana and beyond, stories of Sarah Daniels spread like gospel. The woman who had killed her mistress defied the masters, built a community, and surrendered herself to save her people. To the authorities, she was dead. But to the oppressed, she became something more dangerous, immortal. The Maroons who survived carried her memory into every raid, every whispered prayer in the quarters. Mothers told their children that Sarah's spirit walked the bayou, still her voice in the rustle of reeds, her eyes glowing in the swamp mist, watching over those who dared to dream of freedom. And so Sarah Daniels, born in chains and executed as a rebel, did not vanish with her final breath. She became part of the landscape itself, root, river, and shadow. Not a victim, not even a martyr, a legend eternal as the bayou. Sarah Daniels' body swung from the gallows, but her spirit refused to be stilled. In that moment, the authorities believed they had won, that they had broken the woman who had defied them in her master's bathhouse, in the swamps in their courtrooms. Yet what they silenced was not a woman, but a voice that had already become a chorus. By mid-afternoon, whispers were already moving faster than horsemen across the parishes and plantations. Some said a great white heron circled above the square at the moment of her death, refusing to leave until the crowd had dispersed. Others swore the air went still, the swamp itself holding its breath as the rope snapped taut. In the quarters, old women claimed to have felt a cool hand brush their cheek that morning, as if Sarah herself had come to comfort them before her final walk. Within days, stories transformed fact into legend. To the enslaved, Sarah was no longer flesh, but flame. In some tales, she rose from the swamp as a ghostly woman in white, her hair trailing like Spanish moss, guiding the lost through moonlit waters. In others, she became a warrior spirit, appearing with a musket in hand, at the edges of the cane fields, a warning to cruel masters that their violence would not go unanswered. Planters scoffed, calling it foolish superstition, but they also doubled their patrols and quickened their steps in the dark. What unnerved them most was not the stories themselves, but the way they multiplied alongside fresh escape attempts, small rebellions, poisoned wells, and broken tools. Sarah Daniels had been executed as an example, but instead she became a spark that set tinder smoldering from Louisiana to Georgia. In the maroon settlements that survived the great crackdowns, her name was spoken with reverence. Around firelight, children learned her story not as history, but as inheritance. She was the woman who had traded her life so that others might live free. The one who turned grief into a weapon and who walked into death with her head unbowed. And in the bayou, where the water still runs black beneath the cypress trees, there are those who say she is still there. That when the mist clings low and the frogs fall silent, you can hear her voice on the wind, urging the desperate onward. A reminder that though her body was broken by rope, her defiance could not be chained. Sarah Daniels, the woman, was gone. But Sarah Daniels, the legend, lived on eternal as the swamp itself. The community she helped build survived her sacrifice by scattering through the bayou and reforming in places even better hidden than before. And Mama Bridget lived long enough to see slavery end, while never forgetting the young woman who paid the ultimate price for her beliefs. The tactics Sarah pioneered passed from hand to hand, shaping the strategies of later struggles for civil rights and justice. Master Devo was dead within a year of her execution. Some saying it was grief, and others saying it was fear that more of his former slaves would follow her example. Magnolia Grove was sold off and carved into pieces, its grand house left to rot as the system that fed it collapsed under its own contradictions, and the marble bathhouse where Charlotte died turned into a stop for visitors chasing ghosts they did not fully understand. In the decades that followed, people retold Sarah's story again and again, layering new meanings onto the same hard facts. To some, she warned against rebellion and urged obedience. To others, she was a hero whose courage helped pull slavery toward its end. To women still facing exploitation, she meant something deeper, a living proof that resistance is possible, and that even the least powerful can find ways to fight back. The bayou became a place of pilgrimage for those seeking the truth of her sacrifice, a swamp where Spanish moss hangs like funeral cloth, and where travelers claim to hear singing on the wind or feel a presence in the water that guards the innocent and turns the cruel back on themselves. Whether those moments are miracles or suggestion matters less than what they inspire, because Sarah's legacy rose beyond one lifetime and one set of facts to become a symbol of choosing dignity over degradation, justice over safety, and principle over survival. In a world that often seems built to break anyone who resists her story, keeps offering a way forward to people who refuse to accept that the present must mirror the past. Her life shows that history is shaped not only by the rich and powerful, but also by ordinary people who find extraordinary courage when it is needed most. When she drowned Charlotte Devo, she struck at both a person and a system that had stolen her humanity. And when she fled into the bayou to help build a free community, she proved that freedom is more than the absence of chains. It is the power to choose. More than a century after her death, her name may be missing from many history lessons, but her spirit lives wherever people refuse to accept injustice as fate. The bathhouse is now only ruins, and much of the bayou she once called home has been drained and built over, yet the ideas she died for, the belief that every human being carries an inherent dignity and a right to self-determination, still guide new generations who choose to live and die on their own terms, rather than accept the roles imposed on them.